What drives someone to risk everything for a story the world needs to hear? In April 1993, investigative journalist Kelly Harlow disappeared while pursuing a lead in a remote mountain country. Her colleagues assumed she'd gone off-grid for the investigation. Her family hoped she'd surface with answers. But 18 years of silence ended when hikers discovered something extraordinary at a cave entrance. Her jeep, untouched, exactly where her final notes suggested she'd be. Before we begin, a quick like and subscribe is always appreciated. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Kelly Harlow wasn't the kind of journalist who chased headlines for glory. She was the kind who spent months verifying sources, cross-checking documents, and building cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. At 34 years old, she'd already earned a reputation in Denver's journalism community as someone who didn't give up on stories others abandoned. Her editor at the Rocky Mountain Chronicle, Robert Dennison, once said she had an instinct for finding truth in places most people wouldn't think to look. Kelly grew up in Boulder, Colorado, where her father worked as a forest ranger and her mother taught elementary school. She learned early how to navigate rough terrain and trust her judgment in isolated places. Those skills would become crucial in April of 1993, when she decided to follow a lead that would take her into the back country of western Colorado. But what was she investigating? The story Kelly was chasing involved allegations of illegal dumping in protected wilderness areas. For nearly 6 months, she'd been gathering evidence that certain construction companies were disposing of hazardous materials in remote mountain locations to avoid proper disposal fees. She had documents, photographs, and interviews with former employees who were willing to go on record. But Kelly needed the final piece: physical proof of an active dumping site. Her notes from early April showed she'd received a tip from an anonymous source who claimed to know the exact location of one such site. The source had worked for West Ridge Construction, a mid-sized company based in Grand Junction. According to Kelly's notebook, this person provided coordinates to a location near the Unsolved Plateau, a rugged area known for its deep canyons and limestone caves. Kelly told her editor she'd be gone for 3 to 4 days. She packed camping gear, her camera equipment, and enough provisions for a week. On April 14, 1993, she drove out of Denver in her tan Jeep Wrangler. Kelly's last confirmed contact with anyone was on April 15th, when she called her sister, Margaret, from a payphone in the small town of Nucla. Margaret remembered the conversation clearly. Kelly sounded focused and determined, not worried or afraid. She said she was close to finding what she needed and expected to be back in Denver by April 18th. She mentioned the terrain was more challenging than she'd anticipated, but nothing she couldn't handle. Margaret asked if Kelly wanted her to alert anyone if she didn't hear from her by a certain date. Kelly laughed and said that wouldn't be necessary, but she'd check in when she got back to an area with better phone service. That was the last time anyone in Kelly's family heard her voice. When April 18th came and went with no word from Kelly, her editor began making calls. He contacted the Montrose County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing person report on April 20th. But what did authorities find when they started searching? The initial search efforts were limited by the vastness of the area Kelly had gone to investigate. The Unsolved Plateau covers hundreds of square miles of remote wilderness. Sheriff's deputies and volunteer search teams focused on known roads and trails, but there were countless side roads and unmapped paths that a four-wheel drive vehicle could access. Search crews found no trace of Kelly or her Jeep in the first week. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the plateau, looking for any sign of a vehicle or campsite. Ground teams checked with ranchers and residents in the surrounding communities. No one reported seeing Kelly or her distinctive tan Jeep after she left Nucla. By early May, the search was scaled back due to spring storms that made the high country dangerous to navigate. Kelly's family hired a private investigator, a former state trooper named Vincent Hall, who spent the summer of 1993 combing through Kelly's research and retracing her steps. Vincent interviewed the anonymous source who'd given Kelly the coordinates. The man, whose name was Thomas Ridgway, seemed genuinely shaken by Kelly's disappearance. Thomas told Vincent that he'd provided Kelly with precise directions to a canyon where he'd personally witnessed illegal dumping 2 years earlier. He said the location was accessible by a narrow dirt road that branched off from a main Forest Service road. The road led to a box canyon with a cave system at its far end. Thomas had worked for Westridge Construction for 5 years and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what he'd seen. He'd watched crews unload barrels marked with hazard symbols and roll them into cave openings where they'd disappear into underground chambers. When he finally decided to speak up, he chose Kelly because he'd read her previous work and trusted she'd handle the information responsibly. Thomas gave Vincent the same coordinates he'd given Kelly. Vincent drove to the location in July of 1993 and found the dirt road Thomas described. But when Vincent reached the box canyon, he found no evidence of recent vehicle traffic. What he did find troubled him deeply. The mouth of the cave Thomas mentioned was partially concealed by a rockfall. Vincent couldn't tell if the rockfall was natural or had been deliberately created. He photographed the area and noted that the road leading to the canyon showed signs of having been graded or smoothed, possibly to remove tire tracks. Vincent reported his findings to the Montrose County Sheriff's Office, but without Kelly's Jeep or any concrete evidence of foul play, there was little law enforcement could do. The case remained open, but inactive. Kelly's family held out hope that she'd somehow survived and would return with an explanation. Her mother, Dorothy, kept Kelly's apartment in Denver exactly as she'd left it, convinced her daughter would walk through the door someday. Years passed with no answers. Kelly's colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Chronicle continued pursuing the illegal dumping story, eventually publishing an investigation in 1995 that led to state hearings. But Kelly's name appeared in that report as a journalist who'd gone missing while investigating the story. The question that haunted everyone was simple yet profound. Where was Kelly Harlow? Her Jeep was a distinctive vehicle, a 1988 Wrangler in beige with a black soft top. Someone should have spotted it if it was anywhere accessible. The vehicle identification number was circulated nationally. Law enforcement in neighboring states were notified. But years went by with no sightings, no leads, no trace. Kelly's family eventually held a memorial service in 1997, though they never stopped hoping for answers. Margaret, Kelly's sister, became an advocate for missing persons, working with families who faced similar uncertainty. She often spoke about the unique pain of not knowing, the inability to grieve properly, because there was always a chance however small, that Kelly might still be alive. By the early 2000s, Kelly's disappearance had become a cold case, one of those mysteries that investigators thought about but had no new angles to pursue. Then, in May of 2011, nearly 18 years after Kelly vanished, two experienced hikers made a discovery that would finally provide answers. Brandon Mitchell and his wife, Corinne, were exploring a remote section of the Uncompahgre plateau that few people visited. They were both geologists with a passion for cave systems and had obtained permits to survey several known caverns in the area. On May 7, 2011, they were hiking along a ridge when Brandon noticed something unusual in a canyon below. Through his binoculars, he could see what looked like the roof of a vehicle, partially hidden by vegetation and rocks. The couple debated whether to investigate immediately or mark the coordinates and report it to authorities. They decided to climb down and take a closer look. The descent into the canyon was treacherous, requiring careful navigation of loose rock and steep slopes. When they finally reached the canyon floor and pushed through the overgrown brush, they found themselves standing in front of a 1980s-era Jeep Wrangler. The vehicle was rusty and faded, but still intact. What they saw next made them immediately call for help. The Jeep was positioned nose first toward a large cave opening, as if the driver had been about to investigate the cave when something interrupted them. The vehicle's doors were closed, and the windows, though dirty, were unbroken. Brandon and Corinne didn't touch anything, but walked carefully around the Jeep, taking photographs. They could see through the windows that the interior contained equipment: a camera bag, a backpack, what looked like notebooks or papers. There were no human remains visible inside the vehicle. The license plate was still attached and readable, though corroded. Brandon wrote down the number and called the Montrose County Sheriff's Office using a satellite phone. He explained what they'd found and provided GPS coordinates. The dispatcher asked them to wait at the location, if possible. Brandon and Corinne set up a temporary camp on a flat area near the Jeep and waited. Within 3 hours, a sheriff's helicopter arrived. Deputies rappelled down into the canyon, and, within minutes of checking the vehicle identification number, they knew whose Jeep they'd found. Sheriff Michael Torres, who'd been a deputy back in 1993, when Kelly first disappeared, was now in charge of the department. He remembered the case well and had often wondered what had happened to the dedicated young journalist. Now, 18 years later, they had her vehicle. But where was Kelly? A full forensics team was dispatched to the site. The remote location made it a challenging recovery operation. Equipment and personnel had to be brought in by helicopter. Crime scene investigators documented everything before the vehicle was touched. They photographed the Jeep's position, the surrounding terrain, the cave entrance, and every detail of the scene. When they finally opened the Jeep's doors, they found Kelly's belongings remarkably preserved by the dry climate. Her camera contained undeveloped film. Her notebooks were filled with detailed observations and sketches. Her camping gear was packed in the back as if she'd planned to use it. But Kelly herself was not in the vehicle. The search for answers was about to enter a new phase. Investigators established that the Jeep had been at this location for a very long time, likely since April of 1993. The vegetation growing around and through parts of the vehicle confirmed this timeline. Shrubs that typically took years to reach certain sizes had grown up through the wheel wells. The tires were flat and cracked from nearly 2 decades of sun exposure. Rust patterns indicated the vehicle hadn't been moved since it was first parked. This discovery raised immediate questions. If Kelly had been at this location investigating the cave, where had she gone? Why hadn't she returned to her vehicle? Search and rescue teams began a comprehensive search of the immediate area. They explored the cave system, where Kelly's Jeep had been pointing. The cave entrance was large enough to walk through upright, and it extended deep into the mountainside. Teams with specialized cave rescue training entered the system with lights, ropes, and communication equipment. What they found inside would help piece together Kelly's final hours, but would also deepen the mystery. The cave system was extensive, with multiple chambers and passages branching off from the main corridor. About 200 feet into the cave, investigators found evidence of the illegal dumping Thomas Ridgway had described. There were dozens of corroded barrels, some leaking contents that had formed mineral deposits on the cave floor. The barrels were marked with hazard symbols and company markings that matched Westridge Construction. Kelly had found exactly what she'd been looking for: concrete proof of illegal disposal of hazardous materials in a protected area. Deeper in the cave, about 300 feet from the entrance, search teams made another discovery. They found Kelly's professional camera sitting on a rock ledge, carefully positioned as if she'd set it there intentionally. The camera was inside a waterproof bag, which had protected it from moisture. Near the camera, investigators found a small notebook that wasn't among Kelly's things in the Jeep. This notebook contained Kelly's observations from inside the cave, dated April 16, 1993. The entries were methodical and detailed. Kelly's cave notebook described her initial entry into the system. She'd documented the barrels, photographed them, and noted their locations. Her writing showed the careful attention to detail of an experienced investigative journalist. She recorded serial numbers from the barrels, sketched a rough map of the cave layout, and wrote observations about the environmental damage she could see. Her entries indicated she'd been in the cave for several hours on April 16th, working alone to document everything she'd found. The final entry in the notebook was timed at 4:30 in the afternoon. Kelly wrote that she'd heard unusual sounds deeper in the cave system, a rumbling or groaning that concerned her. She noted that the cave had multiple levels and some areas where the ceiling showed cracks. Her last sentence read, "Going to check stability of the main chamber ceiling before I leave. Want to make sure this evidence will still be here when authorities arrive." That was where her documented observations ended. But what happened next? Geological experts who examined the cave after Kelly's Jeep was found determined that the system had experienced at least one significant rockfall sometime in the past 2 decades. Evidence of this collapse was found in a section of the main chamber about 400 feet from the entrance. Large sections of ceiling had come down, blocking what had previously been a passage to deeper chambers. The rockfall had created a barrier of boulders and debris that filled the passage from floor to ceiling. Dating the exact time of the collapse was difficult, but geologists noted that the rocks showed weathering patterns consistent with having fallen many years earlier. The positioning of Kelly's camera and notebook suggested she'd been working in the section of cave before the collapse zone when something prompted her to set her equipment down. Search teams carefully excavated around the rockfall area, looking for any sign that Kelly might have been caught in the collapse. This work took several days and required specialized equipment to safely move large rocks. What investigators found behind the rockfall changed everything they thought they knew about Kelly's disappearance, when they'd cleared enough debris to see into the space beyond. They found a small chamber that had been completely sealed off by the collapse. Inside that chamber, they found evidence that Kelly had taken shelter there. There was a camping stove, a sleeping bag, water bottles, and food wrappers. Kelly had apparently been trapped behind the rockfall and had survived there for some time. The chamber had a small opening high in one wall that led to another passage, providing some air circulation. But that passage was too narrow for an adult to climb through. Investigators found Kelly's driver's license and press credentials in the chamber, along with more notebook pages. These pages told a story of survival, determination, and ultimately, a journalist's commitment to getting her story out, even when facing impossible odds. Reading Kelly's words from that sealed chamber was emotional for everyone involved in the recovery. Kelly's notes from the sealed chamber were dated starting April 16th, beginning around 7 in the evening. She described hearing the rumbling sound grow louder and making a decision to move to what she thought was a safer area of the cave. She'd just reached the small chamber when the ceiling collapsed, sealing the passage behind her. Kelly wrote that the collapse was terrifying. The sound, the dust, the shock of being suddenly cut off from the exit. But her training and temperament kept her focused. She took inventory of what she had with her. She'd been carrying her backpack, which contained her camping stove, some food, water, and a first aid kit. She had a flashlight with fresh batteries and a backup set. She had her notebooks and pens. Most importantly, she had the photographic evidence she'd gathered. Kelly's first priority, according to her notes, was to assess her situation rationally. She explored the small chamber and found the narrow passage that provided air. This discovery gave her hope that she might find another way out. Kelly spent what she estimated was 2 days trying to find an escape route. She documented her attempts to climb through the narrow passage, but it became increasingly tight until she could go no further. She tried to dig through the rockfall that blocked the main passage, but quickly realized the rocks were too large and too unstable to move without proper equipment. By her 3rd day in the chamber, Kelly's notes showed she was accepting that rescue was unlikely. She wrote, "The cave-in happened deep enough in the system that even if search teams come looking, they might not search this far. The entrance might be blocked or hidden. I need to think clearly about what I can do from here." What Kelly decided to do next demonstrated remarkable courage and presence of mind. Rather than despair, she chose to use her time to ensure her investigation wouldn't die with her. She began writing a comprehensive report of everything she'd discovered about the illegal dumping operation. Kelly's report, written over several days in the sealed chamber, detailed everything she'd learned during her 6-month investigation. She listed names of the sources who'd spoken to her, including Thomas Ridgway. She described the documents she'd obtained, showing Westridge Construction's contracts and waste disposal manifests that didn't match the amounts of waste actually being properly disposed of. She explained how she'd traced the discrepancies and built a case that hazardous materials were being dumped illegally. She documented the location of the barrels in the cave, their markings, and her photographic evidence. She wrote out everything she would have included in her published article. Kelly noted in her journal that she was writing this report so that even if she didn't make it out, someone finding her notes could complete the story. She wrote, "This isn't about me getting the byline anymore. It's about making sure these companies can't poison our wilderness without consequences. Someone needs to know what's here." Her dedication to the story over her own survival was extraordinary. As days passed in the sealed chamber, Kelly's notes showed her managing her resources carefully. She rationed her food and water, knowing that her supplies were limited. She used her camping stove sparingly to heat water and prepare small meals. She kept careful track of time by monitoring her watch and noting when she slept. By her account, she survived in that chamber for approximately 11 days. Her final dated entry was from April 27, 1993. She wrote about thinking of her family and hoping they would know she hadn't given up. She mentioned her sister Margaret by name and wrote messages for her parents. She expressed no regret about pursuing the story, only sadness that she wouldn't be there to see it published. Kelly's final written words were, "I found the truth. That has to count for something. To whoever finds this, please make sure the story gets told. The evidence is here. People need to know." After that entry, there were no more dated pages. The search team that found Kelly's chamber also found her remains. Kelly had died in that sealed chamber, most likely from dehydration after her water supply ran out. The medical examiner who reviewed the case determined she'd survived for at least 10 to 12 days after being trapped. There was no evidence of injury from the rockfall itself. Kelly had successfully taken shelter before the collapse. She'd simply been unable to escape and had no way to signal for help from that deep in the cave system. The location where she'd been trapped was far enough from the entrance that even the search teams in 1993 wouldn't have heard her if she'd called out. The discovery brought closure to Kelly's family after 18 years of uncertainty, but it was a painful closure. Margaret Harlow told investigators that knowing Kelly had survived for days, hoping for rescue that never came, was almost harder to bear than not knowing. Yet she also said there was something profoundly like Kelly in the way she'd spent her final days working to complete her investigation. The news of Kelly Harlow's discovery made national headlines in 2011. The story captured public attention not just because of the mystery's resolution, but because of Kelly's extraordinary dedication to her work. News outlets across the country ran stories about the journalist who'd spent her final days documenting corporate wrongdoing, even while trapped in a cave. Kelly's comprehensive report, written in that sealed chamber, became a crucial piece of evidence in legal proceedings that followed. The Colorado Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Westridge Construction based on Kelly's findings. The photographs Kelly had taken, once the film was carefully developed by forensic specialists, showed clear evidence of illegal dumping. The barrels in the cave were tested and found to contain industrial solvents and heavy metals that posed serious environmental hazards. Westridge Construction faced criminal charges for environmental crimes. Several executives were indicted. The case went to trial in 2012, and Kelly's notes and photographs were admitted as evidence. The trial of Westridge Construction executives brought Kelly's work into public view in a way that honored her sacrifice. Prosecutors built their case around the evidence Kelly had gathered, both before her disappearance and during her final days in the cave. Thomas Ridgway, the whistleblower who'd originally contacted Kelly, testified about the dumping operations he'd witnessed. Other former employees came forward during the trial, emboldened by the concrete proof Kelly had provided. The jury heard testimony from environmental scientists about the damage the illegal dumping had caused to the cave system and surrounding watershed. They saw Kelly's photographs, which clearly showed hazard markings on barrels that had no business being in a protected wilderness area. In closing arguments, the prosecutor held up copies of Kelly's handwritten notes from the sealed chamber. He told the jury, Kelly Harlow knew she was dying. She knew she might never leave that cave, but she kept working because she believed in accountability and truth. She gave her life to bring you this evidence. Honor that sacrifice with a just verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of illegal disposal of hazardous waste and environmental crimes. 3 executives from Westridge Construction received prison sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years. The company itself was fined $3.2 million and required to fund the complete environmental remediation of the cave site and surrounding area. The cleanup operation, which began in 2013, took more than 3 years and removed over 200 barrels of hazardous materials from the cave system. Environmental engineers documented extensive contamination that had leached into the groundwater, requiring ongoing monitoring and treatment. The full environmental cost of the illegal dumping was estimated at over $12 million. None of this would have been possible without Kelly's investigation. Her work had provided the roadmap that prosecutors needed to build their case. Legal experts noted that without Kelly's photographs and detailed documentation, proving the company's guilt would have been extremely difficult. Kelly's family established the Kelly Harlow Memorial Fund for Investigative Journalism in 2012. The fund provides grants to journalists pursuing environmental and corporate accountability stories that require significant time and resources. Margaret Harlow, Kelly's sister, became the fund's director. She spoke at journalism schools and press clubs about Kelly's commitment to truth and the importance of supporting investigative work. Margaret often said that Kelly would have been embarrassed by the attention, but proud that her work had made a difference. The fund has supported dozens of investigative projects in the years since its creation. Several have led to significant reforms and criminal prosecutions. In 2014, the Colorado legislature passed the Kelly Harlow Truth in Environmental Reporting Act, which strengthened protections for environmental whistleblowers and increased penalties for companies that retaliate against employees who report violations. The law also required more transparent reporting of industrial waste disposal and created stronger oversight mechanisms. Kelly's impact extended far beyond the single story she'd been investigating. The Rocky Mountain Chronicle, where Kelly had worked, published a special edition in 2011 that included Kelly's investigation, exactly as she would have written it. The editors used her notes, both from before her disappearance and from the sealed chamber, to reconstruct her article. They added context about what had happened to Kelly and the subsequent legal proceedings. But the core of the piece was Kelly's own reporting. The article won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 2012, awarded posthumously to Kelly Harlow. Her parents, Dorothy and Frank, accepted the award on her behalf. Frank Harlow, Kelly's father, spoke briefly at the ceremony. He said, Kelly loved the mountains. She loved the truth. She believed journalism was about service, not glory. She proved that when it mattered most. We're heartbroken that she's gone, but we're honored by how she's remembered. The Pulitzer Committee noted in their citation that Kelly's work exemplified the highest standards of investigative journalism and had led to meaningful change in environmental protection. The cave where Kelly died was permanently sealed after the environmental cleanup was completed in 2016. The Colorado Division of Wildlife determined that reopening the cave to public access would pose ongoing safety risks due to the structural instability that had caused the original rockfall. Before sealing the entrance, officials installed a bronze plaque at the site. The plaque reads, Kelly Harlow, journalist, 1958 to 1993. She came to this place seeking truth and evidence of environmental crimes. Her courage and dedication led to justice and reform. Her work reminds us that some stories are worth any sacrifice. The site is accessible only by hiking several miles on rough terrain, but people do make the journey. Margaret Harlow visits every year on the anniversary of the day Kelly's Jeep was found. She's often joined by other journalists, former colleagues of Kelly's, and people who were inspired by Kelly's story. The remote location seems fitting for someone who was never afraid to go where the story led. Investigators later determined exactly why Kelly hadn't been found during the original search in 1993. The dirt road leading to the Box Canyon, where she'd parked, had been deliberately obscured shortly after Kelly's disappearance. Someone, likely connected to Westridge construction, had used heavy equipment to make the road harder to see and follow. They'd also pushed rocks and debris to partially cover the cave entrance, making it less obvious from a distance. This explained why early search teams had missed the location and why Vincent Hall, the private investigator, had found the area looking different from Thomas Ridgway's description. During the Westridge trial, evidence suggested that the company had become aware of Kelly's investigation in mid-April of 1993. An internal email, subpoenaed during discovery, referenced the reporter problem and mentioned securing the site. While prosecutors couldn't prove anyone had intended to trap Kelly in the cave, they did establish that the company had deliberately concealed evidence after learning she was investigating them. This obstruction had indirectly prevented rescuers from finding Kelly in time. The case raised questions about how companies respond when their illegal activities are exposed. Security experts who analyzed the Westridge situation noted that the company's attempts at concealment had actually made their legal problems worse. If they'd simply allowed Kelly's investigation to proceed and cooperated with authorities, they might have faced fines and oversight but avoided criminal prosecution. Instead, their efforts to hide evidence and obscure the cave location contributed to Kelly's death and transformed what could have been a regulatory matter into a criminal case with prison sentences. Corporate ethics programs now sometimes use the Westridge case as an example of how cover-ups create greater liability than the original wrongdoing. Business schools teaching crisis management discuss how Westridge's response to Kelly's investigation led to outcomes far worse than transparency would have. The case became a study in the consequences of prioritizing short-term concealment over long-term accountability. For journalism schools, Kelly's story became something different, An example of the real risks reporters sometimes face when investigating powerful interests. Safety protocols for investigative journalists covering environmental stories were strengthened in many newsrooms after Kelly's death. The Rocky Mountain Chronicle and other papers implemented policies requiring reporters going into remote areas to file detailed location plans and maintain regular check-ins. Some news organizations began using GPS tracking devices and satellite communicators for reporters on isolated assignments. The Society of Professional Journalists issued guidelines emphasizing the balance between getting the story and maintaining reasonable safety precautions. These changes acknowledged that Kelly's death, while tragic, had resulted from an unpredictable accident rather than recklessness on her part. She had followed standard practices for her era and had notified people of her general location. The rockfall that trapped her was a geological event that could not have been foreseen. Yet the journalism community recognized that better safety protocols might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The challenge was maintaining the investigative spirit that drove journalists like Kelly while implementing protections that could make a difference in emergencies. Kelly's camera equipment was donated to the museum before it closed, where it was displayed as part of an exhibit on journalists who died in the line of duty. The exhibit included her camera, one of her notebooks, and the bronze plaque that had been made as a template before the permanent one was installed at the cave site. Visitors to the exhibit could read excerpts from Kelly's final notes and see some of her photographs from the cave. The display emphasized that journalism casualties aren't limited to war correspondents. Reporters covering environmental issues, corruption, and corporate wrongdoing also face real dangers. The exhibit noted that Kelly was one of dozens of journalists worldwide who die each year while investigating stories that powerful interests would prefer to keep hidden. After the museum closed, Kelly's items were transferred to the Journalism Museum at the Museum Collection at the University of Maryland, where they remain part of the permanent collection. Her camera still has the film inside that couldn't be developed. The roles she was planning to shoot for the published article, but never got to use. Thomas Ridgway, the whistleblower who had contacted Kelly, struggled with guilt for years after learning what had happened to her. He gave several interviews where he expressed his belief that he'd sent Kelly into danger by providing the cave location. Margaret Harlow reached out to Thomas after the trial and told him directly that Kelly's family didn't blame him. She explained that Kelly had made her own choice to pursue the story and that Thomas's decision to come forward had ultimately led to the accountability Kelly sought. Thomas became an advocate for stronger whistleblower protections, testifying before state and federal committees about the need for laws that protect people who report corporate wrongdoing. He pointed out that both he and Kelly had paid high prices for exposing the truth. He'd lost his career and faced threats, while Kelly had lost her life. Thomas argued that society needed to make it easier and safer for people to report environmental crimes and corporate misconduct. His advocacy contributed to the passage of enhanced whistleblower protection laws in Colorado and several other states. The environmental damage caused by the illegal dumping that Kelly documented took many years to remediate. The cleanup crews found that hazardous materials had leached into the groundwater system, feeding several streams in the area. Contamination was detected as far as 3 miles from the cave site. Wildlife in the area showed elevated levels of heavy metals, and fish populations in affected streams were severely diminished. The remediation project involved not just removing the barrels, but also treating contaminated soil and water, monitoring wildlife, and implementing long-term environmental recovery plans. Biologists working on the project said the damage would take decades to fully heal. Some areas might never completely recover. The project became one of the largest environmental cleanup operations in Colorado history. Scientists studying the site produced numerous research papers on the long-term effects of illegal dumping and the challenges of remediating cave ecosystems. Several noted in their papers that without Kelly in Harlow's investigation, this damage might have continued for years longer, spreading contamination over an even wider area. The box canyon where Kelly's Jeep was found became an unintended memorial site. Even after the cave was sealed, hikers who made the difficult trek to the location often left flowers, press badges, notebooks, or other tributes. The National Forest Service initially tried to discourage this, concerned about the impact on the remote location, but eventually recognized that the site had taken on cultural significance. They installed a small official trail marker indicating the direction to the Kelly Harlow Memorial Site and asked visitors to practice leave no trace principles, except for the memorial area near the plaque. Photographers have documented the changing tributes over the years. Some items left at the site reflect journalism. Notebooks with handwritten messages thanking Kelly for her sacrifice, press credentials from reporters who visited to pay respects. Others reflect the environmental impact of her work. Young trees planted near the site, seeds scattered in remediated areas, artwork depicting wilderness preservation. The site has become a place where people reflect on the cost of truth-telling and the importance of protecting wild places. Kelly's personal journals from her apartment in Denver, which her mother had preserved, were later donated to the University of Colorado's archives. Researchers studying the history of investigative journalism have used these journals to understand Kelly's methodology and thinking process. Her journals showed a reporter who was meticulous, patient, and deeply committed to accuracy. She wrote about the frustrations of sources who wouldn't go on record, the challenge of obtaining documents, and the satisfaction of finding proof that confirmed her suspicions. Reading her journals, it's clear Kelly understood the risks of her work, but believed they were justified by the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable. In one entry from March of 1993, just a month before her final assignment, Kelly wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if this work matters as much as I think it does. Then I see what happens when nobody's watching, when companies think they can cut corners and hide the damage they cause. That's when I remember why this job exists." Her words resonated with journalism students and practicing reporters who faced similar doubts. The geological instability that caused the rockfall trapping Kelly was studied extensively after her remains were found. Scientists from the Colorado School of Mines analyzed the cave structure and determined that the collapse had been caused by water infiltration over many years, weakening the limestone ceiling. The weight of the rock layers above, combined with the chemical composition of the limestone, had created a situation where collapse was eventually inevitable. However, the timing of the collapse, occurring while Kelly was in the cave, was purely coincidental. There was no evidence that any human activity had triggered it. Some initially speculated that vibrations from Kelly moving around might have caused the collapse, but geological analysis showed that the ceiling section would have required far more force to dislodge. The rockfall would have happened whether Kelly was there or not. It was simply terrible timing that she happened to be in the cave when geological processes that had been occurring for decades finally resulted in the ceiling giving way. This finding provided some comfort to Kelly's family. The legal precedent set by the Westridge construction case influenced environmental law in several states. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions cited the case when pursuing companies for illegal dumping. The conviction demonstrated that corporations could be held criminally liable, not just civilly liable, for environmental violations. This shifted the calculus for companies considering illegal disposal. The risks now included prison time for executives, not just fines that could be written off as the cost of doing business. Environmental attorneys noted that Kelly's photographic evidence had been crucial in establishing the criminal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Her clear documentation of hazard labels, quantities, and locations had made it impossible for the defense to argue that the dumping was accidental or the result of rogue employees. Several states strengthened their environmental crime statutes following the Westridge conviction, increasing penalties and making it easier to prosecute corporate officers personally. Legal scholars writing about corporate criminal liability often mention the Westridge case as a turning point in how environmental crimes were prosecuted. Robert Dennison, Kelly's editor at the Rocky Mountain Chronicle, retired in 2015 but remained active in journalism education until his death in 2019. He frequently spoke about Kelly and the responsibility editors have to support and protect reporters pursuing difficult stories. Dennison acknowledged that he'd approved Kelly's trip into the backcountry and had sometimes wondered if he should have insisted she take someone with her. But he also noted that Kelly was an experienced outdoors person and that solo reporting was common for the type of investigation she was conducting. Dennison told journalism students, Kelly understood that some stories require going where others won't go. As editors, we have to balance safety with the reality that important work often involves risk. What we can do is make sure reporters are trained, equipped, and that someone always knows where they are. Kelly did everything right. What happened to her was a tragedy, not a failure of judgment. Dennison established a scholarship in Kelly's name at the University of Colorado's Journalism School. Recipients of the Harlow Scholarship are students who demonstrate commitment to investigative reporting, particularly environmental and accountability journalism. Many Harlow scholars have gone on to distinguished careers, and several have noted that Kelly's story inspired them to pursue journalism despite its challenges. The question of whether Kelly could have survived if she'd been found sooner haunted the search teams from 1993. Medical experts who reviewed the case estimated that Kelly had survived between 10 and 12 days after being trapped. The original search efforts had been most intensive during the first 2 weeks after she was reported missing, exactly when she would have still been alive. If search teams had located the cave and heard her calls for help, she almost certainly would have been rescued. The reason they didn't find her came down to the deliberate concealment of the access road and the vastness of the search area. Rescue coordinators emphasized that even with the benefit of hindsight, finding Kelly would have required either luck or specific information about her exact location. The Uncompahgre Plateau contained hundreds of similar canyons and dozens of cave systems. Without knowing which one Kelly had entered, searchers had faced impossible odds. This reality offered little comfort, but helped explain why dedicated search teams had failed to find her despite their best efforts. Brandon and Corinne Mitchell, the hikers who discovered Kelly's Jeep in 2011, later said finding the vehicle had changed their lives. They'd given investigators the closure they needed and Kelly's family the answers they'd sought for 18 years. But both struggled with the emotional weight of the discovery. Corinne told an interviewer, "We kept thinking, what if we'd explored that canyon 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier? Could we have found Kelly when she was still alive if we'd just been hiking a different route on a different day back in '93? Mental health professionals who work with people who discover human remains explained this response as a form of survivor's guilt, even though the Mitchells had no connection to Kelly's situation. The couple eventually met with Margaret Harlow, who thanked them for bringing Kelly home. That meeting helped the Mitchells process their feelings about the discovery. They continued their geological work and cave exploration, but always carried emergency beacons and satellite communicators, mindful of how quickly an adventure could become a survival situation. Kelly's photography equipment became a teaching tool for journalism programs emphasizing the importance of documentation. The camera she'd left on the rock ledge inside the cave showed deliberate placement. She'd protected it in a waterproof bag and positioned it where it wouldn't be damaged by falling rocks or water. Even facing a life-threatening situation, Kelly had been thinking about preserving evidence. Her film from before the rockfall, once developed, showed professional quality images that clearly documented the illegal dumping. Each photograph was carefully composed to show context, detail, and identifying information. Experts noted that Kelly's photographic technique demonstrated training and experience. She'd known exactly what details prosecutors would need and had captured them methodically. Photography professors used Kelly's work as an example of documentary photography, done under extreme conditions. The images showed not just technical skill, but journalistic judgment about what needed to be recorded. Students studying the photographs learned lessons about evidence gathering that went beyond camera operation to encompass strategic thinking about how images would be used. The sealed chamber, where Kelly spent her final days, became the subject of ethical debates among cave rescue experts. Some argued that the chamber should have been preserved as Kelly had left it, as a historical site documenting her survival efforts. Others contended that recovering Kelly's remains and removing evidence for legal proceedings was the appropriate and respectful action. The decision to seal the cave entirely after cleanup satisfied both perspectives by ensuring the site wouldn't become a tourist attraction while also preventing further access that might disturb what many considered hallowed ground. Cave conservation groups used Kelly's story to highlight the dangers of underground exploration and the importance of never entering cave systems alone. Her experience demonstrated how quickly a stable cave could become a death trap. The National Speleological Society incorporated lessons from Kelly's case into their training programs, emphasizing that even experienced outdoors people could encounter situations in caves that would be survivable above ground, but deadly underground. The particular danger of rockfalls in limestone formations became a specific focus of cave safety education. Kelly's survival for over 10 days in the sealed chamber with limited supplies demonstrated both her resourcefulness and the limits of human endurance. Survival experts who analyzed her situation noted that she'd done everything possible to extend her life. She'd rationed her food and water carefully, maintained her body temperature with her sleeping bag, and conserved the batteries in her flashlight by minimizing unnecessary use. Her background, growing up with a forest ranger father, had given her practical survival knowledge that served her well. The cause of death, determined by the medical examiner, was dehydration complicated by hypothermia. Even with careful rationing, her water supply had eventually run out. The cave temperature, while not freezing, was cool enough that maintaining body heat over many days had gradually depleted her energy reserves. Medical experts said that Kelly had likely remained conscious and coherent almost until the end, which explained why her final journal entries showed clear thinking and careful writing. Her death, while inevitable once trapped, had not been immediate or violent. She'd simply run out of the resources needed to sustain life. The question of what Kelly had thought about during those final days was partially answered by her journal entries, but much remained private. She'd written about her family, her work, and her hopes that someone would find her evidence. But there were also passages that were deeply personal, reflections on her life, memories of moments that had mattered to her, and thoughts about mortality that came from facing death directly. Margaret Harlow, who read all of Kelly's final writings, chose to keep some portions private, sharing them only with family. She felt that Kelly deserved to have some thoughts remain personal rather than becoming public property. What Margaret did share was Kelly's lack of bitterness or self-pity. Kelly had written about acceptance rather than anger, about gratitude for the life she'd lived rather than regret over what she'd miss. In one passage Margaret did share publicly, Kelly had written, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm only sorry I won't see how this story ends. But I did my part. Someone else will finish it." That faith that her work would matter proved to be well-founded. The environmental monitoring required by Westridge Construction's settlement continued for 25 years after the cleanup. Scientists tracking the recovery of the affected area documented gradual improvement in water quality and wildlife health. Fish populations began recovering around 2016, though they remained below pre-contamination levels. Vegetation in areas where contaminated groundwater had affected plant health showed signs of recovery. The long-term nature of the monitoring project meant that multiple generations of researchers worked on the site, with senior scientists training younger colleagues on the project's history and methods. Many of these researchers said they felt connected to Kelly Harlow's legacy. They were completing the work she'd started, not just documenting environmental damage, but seeing it through to remediation and recovery. Scientific papers published about the site often included acknowledgments thanking Kelly for bringing the contamination to light. One paper's acknowledgment section read, "This research would not have been possible without the investigative work and ultimate sacrifice of journalist Kelly Harlow, whose commitment to environmental truth made this entire remediation project possible." Kelly's story reached beyond journalism and environmental circles to inspire people in various fields who faced ethical challenges in their work. Whistleblowers in other industries cited her example when deciding whether to come forward about wrongdoing they'd witnessed. Some said that knowing Kelly had died pursuing the truth gave them courage to take risks in exposing problems in their own organizations. Ethics professors used Kelly's case in discussions about personal integrity and professional responsibility. The question they posed to students was simple but profound: what principles are worth personal sacrifice? Not everyone needed to be prepared to die for their work, but understanding what one values enough to take risks for was crucial to ethical decision-making. Kelly had valued truth and accountability highly enough to pursue them despite danger. Her example prompted people to examine their own values and consider what they would be willing to risk for principles they believed in. This broader impact meant Kelly's influence extended far beyond the environmental crimes she'd documented or the journalism she'd practiced. The Westridge Construction Company filed for bankruptcy in 2014, unable to survive the financial penalties and reputation damage from the criminal convictions. The company's assets were liquidated, with proceeds going toward continued environmental monitoring and victim compensation funds. Former employees of Westridge had mixed feelings about the company's demise. Some who'd known about the illegal dumping felt the bankruptcy was justified. Others, who'd worked in divisions unrelated to the environmental crimes, lost their jobs and pensions. This collateral damage from corporate wrongdoing illustrated how illegal actions by executives could devastate entire communities of workers and families. Economic analysts studying the case noted that Westridge's leadership had destroyed a company that had employed over 300 people and had been in business for 40 years. The initial decision to dump illegally had probably saved the company several $100,000 in disposal fees. That decision ultimately cost the company everything, led to prison sentences for 3 executives, and resulted in over $15 million in environmental damage and legal costs. The arithmetic of corporate crime rarely favored the criminals. Margaret Harlow continued Kelly's work in a different form through her advocacy for missing persons and her management of the Kelly Harlow Memorial Fund. She became a voice for families dealing with the uncertainty of having a loved one disappear. Margaret spoke about the unique pain of not knowing, the inability to grieve properly, and the way time seems to stop when someone is missing. Her advocacy helped push for better coordination among law enforcement agencies in missing person cases and for more resources dedicated to long-term investigations of cold cases. Margaret also worked to ensure that Kelly's story remained focused on her journalism rather than just her death. She gave talks where she emphasized Kelly's methodology, her ethical standards, and her contribution to environmental protection. Margaret wanted people to remember Kelly as an accomplished journalist who had made a difference, not just as a victim of tragic circumstances. The balance between honoring Kelly's sacrifice and celebrating her achievements was important to the entire Harlow family. They succeeded in creating a legacy that emphasized both Kelly's courage in facing death and her skill in pursuing truth. The cave system where Kelly died was eventually named Harlow Caverns by the Colorado Board of Geographic Names, despite being sealed and inaccessible. The naming was proposed by the Colorado Grotto, of the National Speleological Society and approved in 2017. The designation ensured that maps and geological records would permanently associate Kelly's name with the location where she'd done her final work. Some felt the naming was appropriate recognition of Kelly's connection to the site. Others argued it was morbid to name a cave after someone who died there. The Board of Geographic Names ultimately decided that the naming honored Kelly's journalism and environmental work rather than sensationalizing her death. The sealed entrance bore a sign with the cave's name and a brief description of its significance. Few people ever saw the sign, given the remote location, but its existence mattered symbolically. Geographic names carry history and meaning. Having Harlow Caverns on official maps meant Kelly's story would be preserved as long as those maps existed. Future generations studying Colorado geography would encounter her name and potentially learn about her work and sacrifice. On April 16, 2023, exactly 30 years after Kelly entered Harlow Caverns for the last time, a memorial service was held at the University of Colorado. Journalism students, environmental advocates, members of Kelly's family, and people whose lives had been touched by her story gathered to remember her contribution. Margaret Harlow, now in her 60s, spoke about how Kelly's values had shaped the family's path over the past 3 decades. She talked about the journalism students who'd received scholarships in Kelly's name, the environmental protections that existed because of Kelly's work, and the justice that had been served because Kelly hadn't given up, even when facing death. Margaret ended her remarks by saying, "Kelly believed that truth matters, that holding the powerful accountable matters, that protecting our natural world matters." She proved those beliefs with her life. 30 years later, we're still feeling the ripples of her courage. That's a legacy anyone would be proud to leave. The service concluded with the planting of a bristlecone pine tree, a species native to Colorado mountains that can live for thousands of years. The tree would stand as a living memorial to a journalist who believed some truths were worth any price. Kelly Harlow had found the story she was looking for. She'd documented it, protected the evidence, and ensured it would outlive her. In the end, that was exactly what she'd set out to do. This gripping tale reminds us why cold cases and unsolved mysteries continue to haunt our collective memory. Stories of journalists who vanished while chasing the truth embody the suspense and dark secrets that make true crime investigations so compelling. When someone goes missing, families searching for closure never forget, and sometimes evidence emerges decades later, bringing breakthrough moments that detective work and forensics make possible. These haunting stories of disappearances, hidden truths, and the search for justice resonate deeply because they reflect real courage in investigative journalism. What mysteries remain buried in forgotten places, waiting to be discovered? Some enigmas demand we never stop searching for answers.